Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Giri-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives, the ways they change the world, and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Sarah Brown. Now, Sarah, of course, became famous as the wife of Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and then the Prime Minister. But since then, she has led a global charity called Their World, which focuses on education around the world and does all sorts of other things as well, including a podcast rather like this one, which focuses on making the world a better place. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Krishna. Thanks for having me on.
Your story is very much about taking the advantages and the life experience that you have and turning it into some good. And obviously your own podcast, Better Angels, focused on how people did that in their lives. But obviously we want to explore that in your own experience and what came to you. So we should really begin with what the original plan was. Before Gordon Brown and Downing Street and all of that, what did Sarah Brown imagine her life, or um,
Sarah Macaulay, yeah.
Sarah Macaulay. What did Sarah Macaulay think her life was going to be?
Well, in my head, I'm still Sarah Macaulay. I know my outside persona is very Sarah Brown, but I went to a state school in North London. I thought that campaigning and marching and having placards was a completely normal thing to do. I grew up in a time when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, so going out to the Rock Against Racism contest or an anti-apartheid march was a very normal way to be able to kind of share what you thought and call for change. And I don't think any of that has ever left me. But along the way, I've went to university, I've worked, I met Gordon, we got married, and the opportunity to live at Downing Street opened up to me, I suppose, the kind of a platform that held a huge amount of privileges where I could learn slowly over time. I certainly didn't learn it quickly, but to use my voice and be able to do slightly more than just march and wave a placard.
Because when you become married to a high profile politician, I mean, do you have to just set aside what you had originally thought?
I don't think you ever have to set aside what you think or what you believe. I think all of us have our own values and our own sense of purpose. And I don't think I lost that. But what I did do was join in alongside Gordon in the role that he held as a government minister, where I was supportive of what he was doing as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But also during that time, because we were living at 11 Downing, well, that complicated thing where you live at number 10 when you're actually at number 11 and vice versa. But you know what I mean. But during that time when he was at 11 Downing Street, I suddenly found myself originally where you inherit a programme of charity receptions and opportunities for people to come and visit a very public building that has no public access. And so I always saw my role during the 13 and a half years, as it turned out to be, of being part of who gets to come through that door, how much you can welcome people in, how you can get people from all over the UK to come in, but you're also there being called on to kind of host and greet and share hospitality with visitors from all over the world. Some of them huge VIPs, political leaders, people making huge decisions, and others people who are making a difference in their own communities or who are bringing something of what they do and know locally into that building too.
Did you enjoy it?
A lot of it I enjoyed. I mean, I think we were there during a time of a lot of ups and downs. So certainly during the time when Gordon was Prime Minister, it was the time of the global financial crisis. So I was still able to host receptions, be part of quite a big campaign that was linked to the G8 summits that I would go and join Gordon at. But also knowing that the backdrop to that was this really unfolding crisis that was taking up every single waking hour of certainly Gordon, but also everyone in his orbit. And I remember very clearly him, getting towards the end of a day and then sort of checking in with someone like Kevin Rudd, who was the Prime Minister of Australia. He would then take over the waking hours so that Gordon could go and get some, there was a sort of rolling 24/7 cycle of dealing with that crisis. So that wasn't my job or my role, or I had no part in it, but you're certainly there in the midst of it.
Did you feel under scrutiny in the way? I mean, in the last few weeks, obviously, Carrie Johnson and Rishi Sunak's wife as well have been under really, a lot of press scrutiny. Did you feel that at the time, or do you think things have changed?
I think there's always been a press scrutiny on political spouses, and certainly it seems to have grown over the years. I think for Cherie Blair, she came under a lot of scrutiny during her time at Number 10. I felt that I did as well. I do remember that time when Gordon was Chancellor, thinking to myself, feeling that I was under quite a lot of scrutiny, and everything I was doing, I'd be aware that would go under the microscope. And then that move when he became Prime Minister, I realised I had known nothing about the step change, because suddenly you were much more visible and people would recognise me a lot more, and anything I was doing could then be fed back and reported. So that step change into Number 10 Downing Street and being the spouse of Prime Minister is a very different move. And I used to live, as I think all spouses do, you walk around and lead a fairly normal life. People obviously usually quite surprised that you're not sort of under lock and key and with huge amounts of security. So I'd be able to go out with the kids into the park or go and jump on the tube or go off and do some shopping. But you would notice that you were much more visible, and people will come up and have conversations with you and talk to you as though they know you very well, which I suppose they do in a way by that point. And one of the things that I did do is I wanted to find a way where I could show who I was and what we were doing, recognising that kind of public side and public responsibility to being a spouse. That they do say that kind of who you are and what you're about is very much related to why you should be there and why you have that opportunity, I suppose, to be in that position. So I started Twitter, which I appreciate is just as much in the news at the moment these days. But I remember going to the press office at Number 10 and saying, I think I should be doing something just to show sort of daily life or what we're doing, and that might allow me also to kind of keep some of the family life a bit more private. And them going, terrible idea, absolutely awful, don't go anywhere near social media, don't touch it. I wasn't in a position where I needed to be, no one can really tell you what to do, to be honest. You don't have a position, you're not in an official role, there's nothing that you sign up to. I've always said time again that political spouses should do as much or as little as they want, because they know it's a huge opportunity, but there's also other competing demands on life, particularly from family. And therefore, that's really what you can do. And I did go ahead with Twitter. I did try to be, I would say fairly cautious, but really you're just trying to be as open as you can be, to say to people, look, I get it. Gordon's here and he's making big decisions about your lives, and you get to see who we are and what we're about and what we do. You don't necessarily get to see every kid's mealtime and bedtime, but you do get to know who we are and what we're about. And particularly because I was then invited to go and join G8 meetings, or we had the big G20 during our time with gathering everyone together. And I had quite a lot of things I was organising then, so you want that visibility for people. And I didn't often get into trouble. I do remember once there being an alert into the press office where they thought my Twitter had been hacked, and it turned out I had been rather less than green and not turned off my computer screen, and my toddler at that time had gone and typed gobbledygook onto the screen, which had then gone live. And there was a kind of funny hour of super alert as to whether, because there were news programmes dialing in to say, we think there's been hacked, what's gone on. But yeah.
And do you think if you are a political spouse, your behaviour is also fair game? So whether Carrie Johnson breaks the law on parties and whether Akshata Murthy's got her tax affairs in a regular way, I mean, are these things, do you think, you have to be aware of them and you've got to be ready for it, or is it unfair?
Well, there's two different questions there. Do you have to be ready for it? Yes, you do. And will it happen? Yes, it will. Is it fair? I think probably on the whole. I mean, I think if you're doing something that actually breaks the law, it really doesn't matter whether you're the person in office, the person's spouse, or somebody else completely. breaking the law is breaking the law. And I don't even think there's been much pushback on that from the people who've been issued with fines. They've paid their fines and, it is what it is.
What about the tax question?
Well, I mean, family taxes are very close to each other. So I think if I look back and it's sort of like unimaginable to walk in their shoes entirely, but I don't think I would have thought it was unusual to consider what I was doing, or my taxes just wouldn't have been that separate from Gordon's during that time while he's in office. It does feel like quite a battering when something comes at you. I don't think I had to cope with too many things during that time. And if I did, they always felt quite huge at the time, and you look back afterwards and they're not. But yeah, when the media comes at you, everybody will say this whenever it happens, it feels like it's everything, and then it does pass. But the question is really what the issue is and how the public want to respond to it.
I mean, you say you sort of wanted to protect your privacy to some degree, but as it turned out, you went through the most horrific personal experience in the full glare of public knowledge, public gaze. And that, of course, is what has ultimately led to your charity work. And of course, I'm talking about the birth of your daughter, Jennifer, and then her passing. I mean, there's no way you can be prepared for that kind of experience in the public eye, is there?
No, I think that's right, Krishna. I mean, all of those moments, we're seeing it again with Cristiano Ronaldo, who's just lost his son, and it's fairly unbearable to be going through that. And truthfully, the fact that it's on a public stage isn't the thing that affects how painful it is. It's your loss that is the thing that is painful and that you have to go through. There were several things happened to me coming out of the aftermath of losing Jennifer. One was, by virtue of being well known, I never had to tell anybody. And I really feel for, and I hear from mothers who I talk to. I'd talked to an awful lot of women over the years, but it's something that happens too often. And that thing of how you first tell somebody, or people will come and say, so how's the baby? And it's a really painful moment. And I didn't have that. What I had was a huge amount of love and support from people writing. We got tens of thousands of letters and cards came in. It took me the best part of a year to be able to reply to them, because it was just so overwhelming. But two things emerged from it. One is that kindness of people when they will just write to somebody they don't know and share their thoughts and condolences. And the other thing that came out of that experience, and really became the origin to the charity To Their World, was that this was something that happened to too many families. And we're faced where preterm birth, early birth, the vulnerability of prematurity, stillbirth, in our brilliant NHS, in our highly advanced, Western medical systems, we're losing too many babies too soon. And there needed to be things that we could do about it. So for me, that's 20 years ago. And at that time, I was asking questions, mostly because I was reading in letters that I was getting from women saying, this happened to me, and I don't have an explanation for it, or this happened to our family, and we still live with that consequence all these years later. So I understood you don't get over it, but there must be more we could do to try and avert that happening to other families. And so then through that, we created the Jennifer Brown Research Laboratory, which is based in Edinburgh and is the most extraordinary, groundbreaking, a kind of path-defining facility led by a wonderful man called Professor James Boardman. And he's looking at different research projects that are trying to uncover and unlock what those causes are of early birth, but also very significantly what the consequences are. And there's a wonderful longitudinal study, a cohort study, that is now looking at several hundred babies and now growing up to children, what happens to them and what the consequences are for them through their lives, having been born early and in really vulnerable circumstances. So I'm really proud of that achievement, but also know that there is quite a lot more to do to be able to change outcomes for other families so that they don't suffer what we did.
Did you have any understanding of why this had happened to you?
So for us, I think there's a lot of unanswered questions. I think there just wasn't the medical science that was there. There wasn't the outcome. It wasn't expected. It wasn't anything anyone could see that was happening. It all happened very suddenly and very traumatically for us. And so I don't think I will ever have the answers to that. But I do know that there have been a lot of changes in understanding how you can understand which pregnancies may result in prematurity, which may result in complications. There's a lot of investigations around infection, around all sorts of other areas that can cause difficulties at that time. So I think it's changing. And one of the things that was very touching for us was Catherine Smith, who's a lawyer in Edinburgh, who's a mum of a very early baby. Catherine is the late Labour leader's John Smith's daughter, and her baby was born very early, her little Ella, who's now thriving. But she was told when her baby was born that her daughter had survived despite being born early and in very difficult circumstances because of the work of the Jennifer Brown Research Laboratory. And people will always say, if you can change one thing and one life, that's enough. And that was the moment for me where I really understood that. I know that the work of the laboratory has affected hundreds, thousands, will go on to do much more. But knowing that you've changed the outcome for one life is a often said cliche and turns out to be very, very true.
How did you go, though, from dealing with the personal tragedy and the heartbreak to, okay, I want to do something about this?
I think I've always been that sort of person where you're looking for how to kind of build on that. I think for us losing Jennifer, there was certainly looking for what could happen at the scientific level, at research level, being able to explore immediate work that you could do. But also at that time, we were talking about the kind of visibility of it. I was living in Downing Street with Gordon under the glare of that watch. And what was also coming up was the international meetings on the global stage, the United Nations meetings, the G8s. And at that time, there was a real focus on what the United Nations had set as goals to be able to change the world, improve the world, were called the Millennium Development Goals. We now have a longer list of sustainable development goals with targets that are very much in everyone's mind. But one of those Millennium Development Goals was to significantly reduce maternal mortality and to reduce the number of mothers who were dying in pregnancy and childbirth around the world. And obviously that was disproportionately high for mothers who are in sub-Saharan Africa, who are in the most poorest communities. We also realised that, shockingly, those figures will also be true in some of the most developed economies where the same reasons, where it's poverty and lack of access to good medical services, stands in the way. So at that time, if I'm going back to 2008, we realised that nothing was shifting around that figure. There was a lot of drive to reduce global poverty, to increase child survival, but you were faced with about 500,000 mothers a year dying in pregnancy and childbirth with no shift in it. So I remember very clearly writing a note and to some of the civil servants to say, could I just get a bit more information about what was happening? Could anyone share with me? And the note came back to say that no one had ever discussed it at any of the G8 meetings where those development goals were on the agenda. That was the one that was missed. And more than that, and this was, one of those moments where you just sit up straight and think, we have to do better than this. The reason was no one had discussed it at the high level meetings because no one had anything to say. That was the reason given. And so that was a moment where I thought, well, I've got something to say and I can find a network of people through the White Ribbon Alliance who've also got something to say. And there must be something we can do using the opportunity that I've got and the platform that I've got at Downing Street. And there's also that moment where you're not a minister, you're not in the government, but you do need the support to be able to use that platform. But it was quite straightforward. The UK government had always been a real leader in international development and was always very bold at promoting actions you could take to improve global poverty and to address those UN goals. So I found that I could actually just run with it from that moment on. So I worked with civil society, we brought in other partners, we had all the Royal Colleges who looked after the obstetricians and gynecologists, the Royal College of Nursing, everybody came on board and then put together a global coalition, had some public relations support, came from Freud Communications, they used their networks into celebrities. It was a big alliance of people together, But I was the one that had the doorway onto the world stage. And so at that point, I could take it into the United Nations, be able to talk on the stage. I was able to even take the chair at one of the meetings that announced ending fees that was actually preventing, it was the sort of charges and costs that went to mothers. There were a number of countries that stepped up, and in the end also was able to actually put the submission into the G8. But the deal at that moment was I obviously couldn't just do it through the UK government. I wasn't the UK government. So I needed to find an ally, and I've always been a great fan of finding surprising allies for good causes. And on that occasion, it was President George Bush who took the maternal mortality campaign proposals through to the G8 and got their approval. So yeah, a surprising ally, but for a very important issue that I think the health and well-being of mothers, everyone from all political backgrounds could come behind.
I mean, you've described how a very individual tragedy, your own, went into an enormous ambition, a global ambition, and way beyond premature births and mothers giving birth, something much, much bigger. So, I mean, just explain, what is their world about? And, can your ambitions be too big, do you think?
I don't think anyone's ambitions can be too big, but I think you have to look at the part that you play. I'm talking about a very big change that happened, but I only played one part in it. It's just I was standing there in the right place at the right time to be able to do that. Their World is the charity that was created 20 years ago. It had a different name, it was smaller, it was community based. It was very much about building the Jennifer Brown Research Laboratory and looking at what gives children and young people that best start in life. And I think that's still a driver for me and certainly the people that I work with. But what's happened to the charity, it was renamed Their World. We expanded our ambitions to more global reach. We have a huge focus on education. And it's just grown and grown over these last 20 years. It's 20 years since it was set up. And can your ambitions have be too big? If you've got a podcast called Ways to Change the World, I don't think you're the person that wants to limit people's ambitions when they come to talk to you. But you do need to look at what it is you can do and the networks you have can do. And all of us are trying to create changes at different levels in different ways. I could use a platform at Downing Street to reach very, very high. I don't have that same platform anymore, but I do have the know-how and the connections and the colleagues who also have a greater expertise than I do, where we can actually set our sights quite high. And so we've shifted in moving from that maternal mortality focus and recognise that the greatest barrier to for children to get that best start in life is through education. And a big driver at the moment is through education in emergencies, where we've seen in these humanitarian crises that we have such a focus on survival and on, I mean, rightly, I'm not speaking against survival, but on nutrition, shelter, emergency healthcare. But we need to recognise that those women, children who are caught in those crises actually need to look at what gives them hope and what gives them that next step. And the missing piece is education. We don't do enough at that early stage to step in. So in all sorts of areas, I think there's a greater focus on education is needed. And at Their World, we have a focus on the bits where we think we can make a difference, and certainly would encourage and support those who are doing other things too.
So how do you set your goals and measure your success?
So in the last few years, what we set our goals at Their World on was looking to unlock the political will for education in emergencies. There was certainly a frustration in the system, I think it's the polite way of putting it, where you could push the button on an emergency. Say we'd talk about Ukraine, as that's top of the news at the moment, where there's a conflict. We've got millions of people fleeing out of that country. A large proportion of them are children. There's an immediate drive to make sure everyone's safe, make sure everyone has shelter, make sure everyone's food and any medical care that they might need. But actually you can't stop there. That is the moment where you've got to have a plan immediately to try and restore a normality for children, to reduce trauma, to provide next steps. And everywhere that I've been in the world where I've met families living in refugee camps, families living in desperate poverty, families who are caught up in a crisis somewhere, the moment that family is safe, the thing that the parents are calling for is how to get their children education. And having heard that over and over again, I know that as we see a new unfolding crisis, that's the steps that we need to be taking.
The big difference, of course, with Ukraine is, I think, in the perception of it as a country in the West, which is, well, it's a developed country like ours, and they'll have education systems like ours. Wars, more often than not, happen in developing world countries where people imagine that education systems are pretty broken down anyway. So, do you think we care more about the need to restore education quickly somewhere like Ukraine than we do in Afghanistan?
No, I think people have been very passionate about the opportunity for education in Afghanistan. People have worked very hard over years to ensure that girls had equal access to education as well as boys, and there's been quite a pushback on that. I think the shift is often to do with what's in the front line of the news, that it's easier to respond to and care and react to whatever the current news story is. But I think wherever you're sharing stories about children and young people missing out on the chance of, learning in their life, education in their life, creating some sort of future for themselves, that becomes a kind of very relevant and valid thing. And yes, of course, we've seen in Ukraine that children 1 week were very happily attending their local school, and then it was disrupted. We've seen that earlier on in Syria too, where it resonates very closely to us to see children who've been in school and having that taken away from them. But I don't think there's a strong difference in how we respond as humanity. I think a lot of it is linked to what's right at the forefront of the news. But there's a huge amount we can do right now to respond to that. Their World's just come back from a trip to Moldova, where we were looking and listening to families on the ground, hearing what the systems are. And of course, what you're seeing is Ukrainian families fleeing. They're used to their children having been at school. They'd like to see that restored. And locally, countries like Moldova, Poland, they're opening their arms to welcome people, but actually also quite overwhelmed with how they can cope with it and how they can do it. So the gold standard is, of course, to integrate children into your local schools and keep moving. What we found when we looked in the past with the Syrian refugees is where that's too much for a system, you can actually change the system to run what they call a double shift school system. So you start the same school earlier in the day and finish it later, but you're running 2 shifts through it. So you actually do have the capacity to do it. And then also there's online opportunities. People are able to learn through apps. People are able to share own language teaching, where we have Ukrainian teachers sharing the curriculum. So there's lots of things you can do, but you need to prioritize it as something that needs to be happening quite quickly and ensure the funding's there. And obviously at Their World, we've had a good look at where the funding is going for humanitarian relief for Ukrainian refugees moving, and only 2.2% is going to education. So when you break that down, everything's done in dollars in this system. Of course it is, but it's about $11.40 per child is what that means, which is not really going to be enough to cover anything. So $11.40 is what, about just over £9. I mean, that's not a budget.
You've got hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children in Poland now going to Polish schools, wherever they've been taken in by Polish families. That's where they need the help, isn't it?
If I'm specific to Their World, we've got quite a lot of knowledge and know-how from work that we've done with Syrian refugees coming through to Turkey, through to Jordan, to Lebanon, and then also we had the refugees coming through onto the Greek islands who came from Afghanistan, come from parts of Africa, also Syrians coming there. There are very good examples of how the system has learnt to accommodate large influxes. The double shift school system works really well, being able to look at what the learning is for which teachers need to be teaching which children, how much you're inviting people into your own local system, or how much you're able to accommodate the system they were used to. A lot of that depends whether you think families are going back soon or whether they're staying with you for a really long time. And then another crucial element that we've learned is around psychosocial support, that the normalising of a school environment is really, really critical to children being able to get through a very traumatic time in their life. And there's a huge body of knowledge and wonderful experts who are able to share what they've learnt before with other children and to bring that into play. So, Polish families are accommodating Ukrainians in their community, but actually overall, being able to accommodate and welcome and support will actually be easier for everybody and better for everybody, not just for those refugees who've arrived. And the time refugees are refugees is so different now. We think of it as a short crisis, and so our whole humanitarian system is built on fixing the immediate problem and somehow everyone will go home, and that doesn't happen anymore. Refugees are refugees on the whole for more than 10 years, much longer than 10 years. So for a child, that's a huge chunk of their childhood, their education, and what their opportunities are for who they get to be in the long run. And let's not forget, this is not just about what the impact is for those refugees and those children. If you're looking at a world where we've got, a number of crises around the world, things that unfold, children whose education is disrupted, you've got to think about who those children grow up to be as young adults, what skills they've got to contribute, to create their own income, to contribute back into their own communities. And it has to be in all of our interests to know that we've been able to give back and support their education so that they're people who also contribute into our economy overall, into our society, rather than people who are left on the outside very disenfranchised.
Do you think Britain should have made more of an effort to take more people in from Ukraine more quickly?
I don't think that as UK I don't think we've done very well at kind of taking in or welcoming families. We've made it very difficult with the systems that we have. But what I am quite touched by is looking at British families, the way they have really shown a lot of kindness. People have contributed financially through the Disasters Aid Committee. People have put in applications to say that they would accommodate families or they'd contribute to supporting them in their local communities. I know that in our village, we've already been told we have a number of Ukrainians who are arriving, and people are organising already to work out not just how to welcome them, but how to support them during their time here. So I think the British people are ready to do an awful lot, but our systems are pretty tough.
But you've had sort of a unique insight into the way government works just by sort of being there, and also NGOs. So why do you need NGOs and charities and people to be filling this space during these kinds of emergencies when you have governments who've got huge numbers of experts and resources and whole departments who are supposed to be good at this?
I'm not sure that all those things are as separate as you think. I don't think government just runs the funding and all the services. I think government has always funded other organisations to run the services. So in this instance, I think a lot of the local authorities might be part of what's driving those services. But also, you talked about the NGOs and the charities. Their world does not take any government funding from any government anywhere, and we've always maintained that. And part of that has been so that we can be quite noisy and quite opinionated and get stuck into what the changes that should happen. But many of those big NGOs actually are funded by large government grants, not just the UK. They'll have applications in with other governments too. So they're providing services that have been funded by government. So it's all mushed up together, really. It sometimes makes the campaigning and the advocacy quite complicated, because if you're working with organisations who are also looking after government funding to deliver services, then you have to kind of look at what their voice can be if you actually need change in the system. But that's a whole separate topic. Your question was around who's delivering the services and who's best placed to deliver the services. And I think that NGOs and those big charities have a big service delivery part to play, as do big chunks of local authorities.
Do you think the connections you got, the fact that you could go to George Bush or whoever it might be for help or advocacy, makes your experience unique? Or are there lessons for other people in turning their own experiences into ways to change the world?
Well, I think in the time that I've done this, and in the time since we left Downing Street, campaigning has changed and advocacy has changed, and where people have a voice has changed. Social media has certainly changed that. Activism has changed. We've seen young people break through onto a global stage and have a really powerful voice. And at Their World, we're investing now into a group of global youth ambassadors. And that's where our really big focus is, where we're training young people with all the skills that we've got, opening up the doors that we have and letting them take that platform. I was very slow to know how to use my voice. The very first time I realized I could actually be the person that was speaking on a stage was quite a long time after, quite a long time into all of this. I just was always the person that would want to kind of usher someone else onto a stage, not take the microphone myself. If I did, I sort of mumbled incoherently into it and just sort of thanked people and wandered away. And somewhere along the line, it dawned on me that if I didn't speak up, I was missing the opportunity to ask for that change. And that's something I want to make sure I pass forward to people, that they can just miss out my mistakes and miss out my fumblings, inadequate moments of speaking and not doing a very good job about it, and get out there and get messages out. I think there's an urgency to it. I think young people know that they need to get on with it, whether their focus is on education, on climate, on vaccine equity, all these areas where we need such big shifts and we need to ask for them quite quickly.
But won't a lot of people say, well, why would anybody listen to me? I get why people would listen to Sarah Brown, because she was famous and she was married to a prime minister and she had a platform. Why would they listen to me when I'm just an ordinary person?
I think that people are listening to young people and are listening to their voice. I mean, I just think if you think about what you've been reading or you've been listening to, when you hear a really clear argument made by a young person about what needs to change, you're going to hear it. So I think us helping any young person say, I don't need to say why me? The answer is really why not me? And if it's why not me, why can I, I can step up and have a voice, then getting your message across in a very short period of time and making it clear and concise is a really important skill to learn. And I'd like any young person to learn it a lot faster than I learned it.
What's the pitfalls then in this kind of advocacy? I mean, what are the things you've got to avoid? We live in a world of culture war on social media, of deep political division. Do you see all of those things as sort of bear traps? That if you get involved in criticizing the government or criticizing particular tribes, then you'll distract people.
Well, you could I guess you could distract people if you're going to speak out on absolutely everything and have a view on everything, or you enter into something where it's a very polarized opinions, then not everyone's going to hear you. And I think there's a particular skill to say, if I need to really focus on what my message is and how I can be heard. I know that during the time of talking about maternal health, it was fraught with people having very strong opinions around reproductive health, around abortion, around all of those areas. And I found myself thinking, I don't think my personal opinion is the relevant thing here. I'm going to really just navigate the message around women's health. I think the same is true for education now. There's all kinds of contentions around who gets education, issues around private versus state education, issues around girls' education and how much we can invest more into girls' education but not at the expense of boys. Everyone has opinions. People have opinions around the use of technology in classroom, about teachers, around, you can walk into a room and hear all kinds of polarized opinions, but you won't get anything done. One of my golden rules at Downing Street, partly because I always had a kind of toddler's bedtime to get back to, was if I walked into a room and everyone was on the technical issue, they were kind of right down the rabbit hole of something, right in the weeds of something, I used to look at my clock, think, I haven't got time for this, and just leave. Now, I know that I was using a privilege that I had where me walking into the room could convene an agenda, but there wasn't time for any of that. And I think all of us have choices to make about the fights we're going to fight on, what we're going to stand up and talk about. We don't always have to get into every single argument. If you're out there on social media, there's a lot there, and there's always people who will want to kind of goad you into something. But we also, by the same token, have to create a little bit of space where we can hear other people with views that are not the same as our own. One of the disciplines of working with the charities, it's not a political environment. You're not out there taking one political side, but it does mean you have to listen to opinions from people where you're not necessarily on the same page as them, or you don't come from the same background as them. it's not unhealthy to do that, in my opinion. And I've certainly been able to use working in the non-profit sector to be able to create more change than I think I might have done if I'd say signed up to be a politician myself.
Do you think collective effort and international cooperation might be coming back into fashion? I mean, we went through a period, particularly during coronavirus, where countries were operating unilaterally. I remember speaking to Gordon about, his frustration with the lack of international cooperation on tackling this massive challenge. I just wondered whether you think Ukraine has brought international cooperation back into fashion.
Well, we've certainly got a position where we're now seen a big seismic shift in the world. So at the risk of sounding like you're interviewing Gordon rather than interviewing me, I think the position that Russia has taken has changed everybody's dynamic and relationship, not just with Russia, but with each other. So how we look to cooperate with each other will make a difference. And I think we've got a golden opportunity now to get that right. None of us have benefited from greater nationalism, greater me first kind of approaches. I think all of the great solutions to great problems, huge problems, have come from moments where we've worked together better. We still have to look at our big international institutions and work out how they can be less cumbersome and more fast acting. We somehow built something very, very big, but we've never quite worked out how to make it work efficiently. When we look at organizations like the United Nations, they can do so much good, but they can't always do it very quickly. And speed, I think, is now, we need a little more speed in the system for it. I hope, I'm always hopeful that we have opportunities for great cooperation, and certainly there will be conversations that have been happening looking at how we come out of the pandemic, looking at how we address the crisis in the Ukraine, where people are talking to each other, leaders are talking to each other in a way where they maybe haven't needed to do so. So yeah, always hopeful.
We've talked about the breadth of your ambitions, but if you could just change the world one way, how would you change it?
If I could do it, just in the next few weeks, I would say that we should launch the finance facility that would allow us to open up a chance to get every single child into school, and that we should set out to do that. So we give every child the best start in life, and we give them the tools with which they can contribute. Because I think we want every citizen in the world to be able to change the world, not just a few people driving it from the top.
Sarah Brown, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Our producer is Freya Pickford, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to watch any of these interviews, you can see them on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.